This is Kyle Cleveland with Temple University Japan's ICAST through the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. I'm here today with Motoko Rich, who's the Tokyo Bureau Chief of the New York Times. Motoko has been a reporter with the Times since 2003, covering a range of issues, including real estate, the economy, books, and education, has been in Japan for a number of years now. She had started her career at the Financial Times in London, also worked at the Wall Street Journal for 6 years in Atlanta and New York. She grew up in New Jersey, Northern California, as a graduate of Yale and Cambridge. So, Motoko, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule.
Thanks for having me.
You know, they say, shall you live in interesting times? And we couldn't have more interesting times than this. Not long ago, we thought that we'd be in the middle of the Olympics right now. COVID seems to be eclipsing all suns. So what's your workflow been like in this last 6 months?
Well, it's been fairly intense. I mean, since I was back in the States over the winter holidays and then went to Hong Kong early in January and came back and sort of very instantly was thrust into the COVID story. The Diamond Princess landed in early February, and that kind of sort of took over my life for the weeks that it was in quarantine in Yokohama. And then since then, we've been tracking the COVID story. I mean, obviously, Japan has been a really interesting COVID case in that it has always seemed to have had things pretty much under control. There was this moment in time where it seemed like, it might be spinning out of control and there was a state of emergency, but things, while certainly there was an increase in cases and unfortunately in deaths as well, it never got to the level that we have seen either in some of the hotspots in Europe and certainly not in the United States. So that has quieted down a little bit, although as we're speaking today on Thursday, July 9th, there's a big spike in Tokyo. So we are keeping our eye on that, and it's a very unpredictable virus that just doesn't go away. So every time we think that it's going to calm down, I mean, I've not had a news story quite like it since I've been in Japan. I mean, my first year here in 2016 and then into 2017, there was a lot to do with North Korea. That was a pretty long standing story when missiles were flying over Japan. And then, as Trump was elected, it became a big story because he and Prime Minister Abe became quite close friends. So there was a lot to write about between U.S. and Japan relations, but none of those stories kind of had the legs and intensity and sort of this seemingly unending quality that COVID has. And then, of course, there have been other things that have been mixed in with that. Obviously, in the United States, there's been sort of the big outbreaks of the protests for Black Lives Matter, and I've written a little bit about that in terms of the Japan context. And now, of course, we're seeing what's happening with the flooding in southwestern Japan and Kyushu, and that kind of is connected to this broader, long-standing story for the whole Earth, which is climate change, which we also write about.
Given the fact that you're representing Japan for the New York Times and you have to cover a whole array of issues, how are you able to manage the flow in which you're dealing with, I presume, a number of issues all at different levels of development at the same time?
That's right. I mean, that's true in any job, but one of the sort of exhilarating things about covering someplace geographically is that you do have a range of subjects. So previously, before I came to Japan, all of my beats in the United States were particular subject areas you mentioned in my bio, like I covered real estate, or I covered the economy, or I covered book publishing or education. So I was really writing about one thematic topic. Whereas here, I get to range across a number of topics. So that means that, of course, right now, the big news story is COVID, but over my time here, I've written about politics and national security and diplomacy and culture and gender and race. And so that's kind of wonderful. And the way you kind of balance that is that there will be things that will happen and that you have to cover. Say, for example, there's a horrible mass murder, the arson in Kyoto last year. That happens. We have to jump and cover that at the moment without thinking too quickly, but just jumping and covering it. Other things are stories that are longer term development, where you're developing sources, you're conducting lots of interviews, you're taking your time to write. So I'm sort of always balancing between the breaking news and features. And I always like to have some features going. And I also like to kind of mine a thematic area in my feature. So last year I did a lot of work on gender, which I've continued to do this year. And under COVID, I wrote a big story about whether or not not kind of working from home was going to affect gender relations in the home. So that's sort of a theme that I'm constantly reflecting on in all of my coverage. But there's always a balance between something like a story that you have to crank out in a day because something has happened and you really have to get it into the news, and other things where it's not necessarily hinged to a particular news event, but rather more broader thematic issue that you're trying to explore in the society.
You're dealing with such a broad array of issues. I don't know how you manage, but one of the issues that you had mentioned was gender, and I know a number of stories that you've written on have focused on that. Being a working journalist in the United States and then coming to Japan that has a very different media culture and also very different gender norms, what's that been like as a female reporter in Japan?
Well, it's been very interesting. I mean, I often say that I am in an extraordinary position of privilege. We talk about at the New York Times that we are aware that because of the institutional backing and the name of the organization for which we report, that opens a lot of doors, and that I know that it's not personal. It's that, I am Motoko Rich of the New York Times, and the New York Times name will open a lot of doors, and that kind of precedes my personality, but also precedes my gender. And Japan is a very kind of status conscious culture. And so the name, the New York Times, certainly opens a lot of doors that might make it more difficult if I didn't have that, and certainly might sort of accentuate the disadvantages of being a woman in Japan. That said, I think that a lot of times, certainly, I mean, I've been here long enough that people knew who I am, but when I first started the job, I think a lot of people upon first meeting me were surprised that the bureau chief for the New York Times was a woman. The last time that was the case was 30 years ago, and so since then it's been a series of men. So I think there's a little bit of a surprise that the senior person for the New York Times in Japan is a woman, and that I'm often walking into rooms here where I'm either the only woman or one of a very few women. And that I think is true for a lot of women who are working women in Japan, that if they're in certain industries or professions, that they're going to be in the minority. And so that is definitely the case. Now, on the one hand, I have Japanese heritage and a Japanese name, which I think, but also, from the Japanese perspective, they look at my face and they consider me Western. And so I think that also gives me a certain kind of so-called privilege here, that I am not expected to live up to certain norms that I think that the Japanese women are. I think they're under an extraordinary amount of pressure in terms of their appearance and their behavior, that I am kind of given a pass on because I'm considered Western.
What are some of the substantive issues or patterns that you've recognized with relation to gender through your reporting?
Well, undeniably. So it was interesting because when I arrived, it was not so long after Prime Minister Abe had declared womanomics as one of the pillars of his economic plan, and that, the way to revive the Japanese economy was to put women to work. And he's very proud of the statistics that the labor force participation rate of women is quite high in Japan. In fact, if you just look at the straight number, it's higher than even in the United States. But if you just dig slightly beneath the surface, you see that there's still an extraordinary amount of sexism and patriarchal structure and behavior in Japanese corporate culture, in government, and in the home. And there are a lot of things that happen here that if I tell them to my friends and colleagues back in the States, are like, whoa, that sounds like, something from the set of Mad Men. It's that there are still situations where you'll walk into a room and the only woman there are the women serving tea, that there has been a debate even in just the last 12 months about whether or not companies can require a woman to wear a certain height of heels to work, that women are still expected to carry the disproportionate burden of housework and childcare in the home, that kind of the aspiration of more wealthy woman still seems to be staying at home with the children, that there are so few women in government positions that it is rare for a woman to be in senior management positions. All of that is abundantly apparent for any short period of time of reporting here in Japan.
I'm sure that one of the norms within journalism is to try to be objective and have fact-based journalism. But in this regard, you're also dealing with cultural norms. And in a sense that there are moral issues about equality. So how do you manage that kind of line between being objective while at the same time, in some ways, you're asserting a kind of, not an agenda, a set of values that might not align with what we're seeing in Japan?
That is an excellent question. So, I mean, the first order of business is always to report the facts. And I think there's a lot of debate around the world, and particularly in journalism, and particularly at the New York Times, about whether or not objectivity is something that we should be pursuing. And our executive editor, Dean Baquet, has talked a lot more about truth and fairness, which I totally believe and agree with. And that, of course, you start with the facts. And there are facts like data, observable events, and then also kind of observable patterns and behavior. And in a lot of the work that I do, it kind of borders on the sociological, particularly when I've been writing about some of the topics where I've been writing about gender, where I've actually been spending time in people's homes, or a lot of time at University of Tokyo, or with groups of single women. But there are still sort of observable data about that. There is OECD data that shows that Japanese men do less domestic work than men in any other OECD country. That's data that's collected by the OECD as self-reported by people who are surveyed. That's not me making that up or asserting some kind of value. That is sort of an observable fact. And then you kind of also look at the sort of aspirations that are set by the society. You do have a prime minister who has said that empowering women, creating a society in which women can shine, is a stated goal of the administration. So I think it's a fair thing for a journalist to do, to say, okay, that's the stated goal of the administration, the ruling party. These are the facts. How do they mesh together? And I think there are some people who look at that and say, oh, you're an advocate and you're pursuing an agenda. But I think it all comes from what's happening within the society that I'm reporting about. And it's also deeply reported. So if I'm going to be writing, say, about single women, the decline in marriage rate, which again is an observable piece of data. I didn't make that up, that the proportion of people between certain age and certain age getting married has declined over the past 20 years. That's not just anecdotal evidence, that's based on government data. And then talking to a lot of people who are in that position and asking them why, and sort of behaving like a sociologist or an anthropologist to draw out as much texture and depth that I can. So if some people see that as an agenda, to me, the agenda is fairness and truth. It's not saying, oh, this way is better or that way is better. I think one of the challenges of being an international correspondent in Japan or anywhere that we all have to be mindful of is, of course, we have our biases. Of course, we have our inherent the cultural norms that we come to the country with, and that we have to be mindful of that when we're reporting, we're not just imposing the place where we come from on the place that we're coming to. I have an interesting mix in that I was raised by a Japanese mother. She's Issei, first generation. So she was born and raised in Japan. And so I was raised with someone who came from this culture. So it's not completely foreign to me, but I was mostly raised in the United States. I was educated in the United States. And so, of course, a lot of my cultural baggage, if you will, comes from the United States.
Well, in a manner of speaking, part of your role is to be a bridge between Japan and these foreign markets like in the United States. It's kind of translational sociology in a way, that you're trying to represent the culture on its own terms while having these more objective reference points. You mentioned the OECD report. I've seen those and used them in my classes. In the last couple of years, I saw a report that out of 140 countries, Japan was ranked 111th on gender equality. And it had pretty sophisticated measures in terms of political participation, work opportunities, human capital, all these various factors. And so objectively, it's quite clear that Japan, I think, is a patriarchal society. But when you're talking about issues like this, if you're building a bridge, it goes in both directions. So you're communicating Japan to the United States, and then in a manner of speaking, vice versa, and not just in Japan, but all around the world. But what have you learned about focusing on these issues of gender roles, about Japanese gender roles, that you think people in the United States or other countries don't quite get when they're looking at it from afar and maybe projecting their own values without the kind of granular, nuanced understanding that you've been able to develop through your reporting?
Right. Well, I think actually that people are often surprised to hear how patriarchal and the depth of the inequality here in Japan, because I think most people's impression of Japan is that it's a very modern, progressive society, that, it's an advanced capitalist democratic society, and that, people who have a very superficial knowledge of Japan see it as a place of, all this techno wizardry and cultural product that they like. And so they're surprised that if they're coming from a Western perspective, They're just sort of, I guess their vague assumption is, oh, it's probably sort of similar to us. But I think what is really interesting about doing this work is that when people become very defensive about Japan, they say, oh, you're judging us and you're criticizing us and we're so behind. But I think, look, reporting by my colleagues in the United States shows that we're not so far apart in a lot of ways, and that there are a lot of commonalities. And what I have found fascinating about writing these stories is that they do get enormous readership. People are really, really interested. And I think they're interested in the shared humanity, the shared experience of it all. It's not just that, what I don't want to do as an international correspondent is come to a culture and be like, ooh, look at these exotic people, as if we're sort of looking in, pushing our nose up against the zoo cage or the aquarium window. I mean, that's very patronizing and horrible. I do not want to be that kind of reporter. And I know that those kind of people exist. And that is not how I see my job. And I do think that a lot of times people read about gender in Japan and say, yeah, we share that experience. I mean, I tell you, I think one of the most popular stories that hit the biggest chord that I wrote last year was about single women and women deciding that they were going to make choices other than to rush into marriage, or they were either postponing or foregoing marriage altogether. And the international response was really powerful. Like a lot of comments on social media, a lot of people writing about it, and it resonated. And it wasn't like, oh, that's interesting, Japanese women are like that. It was more like, yes, I have had a similar feeling or emotion or experience as the woman you interviewed in the story. And so I think that's very powerful, that journalism, when you talk about that bridge, it's a bridge between people, for people to realize that they share so much more than they might originally have expected with a culture that they know so little about.
Right. Yeah, often in Japan, you have these kind of grand narratives, the Nihonjin-ron notion of how Japan appears to Japanese and how Japanese intellectuals or writers represent it. But really on a lived level, you're talking about very simple things like what are the opportunities and life chances available to people? People able to get jobs, what kind of jobs do they get? Today, the average woman in Japan will get married maybe around 30 years of age. It's gone up incrementally from the low 20s to almost 30. Have maybe a child, and then their work opportunities become very limited thereafter. And so women end up in these part-time jobs. So, in terms of employment, you do have a lot of employment, but it's albaito part-time precariat labor and not necessarily full participation in a full-time job with any kind of...
And I think that's a really important point that the Prime Minister often tries to elide, right? When he's talking about I don't have the number off the top of my head, but the very high labor force participation, what he doesn't tell you is that a huge chunk of that are, as you say, women working in part-time or contract jobs for which they don't have benefits, they don't have the ability to get promoted. And then even women who have professional jobs, there's kind of this double-edged sword in Japan where on paper, mothers get what look to be a pretty great kind of progressive package, right? They can take 1 year or up to 2 years off maternity leave. And then after that, they can work these kind of shortened, seemingly humane hours up until, in often cases, their child is 8 or 9 years old. And so that seems great, right? That's very accommodating to to a mother's needs. But what it does is create this sort of mommy track. And so there are a lot of women who have said that on the one hand, yes, it was good that they could leave the office at 4:00 and they could go and pick up their kids and help them with their homework and cook and all of that. What they really would have preferred is that their husbands were also participating more so that they could share the burden of the housework and that both of them could make progress in their careers. Whereas instead what was happening is that the men were going ahead in their careers and the women were kind of juggling two careers, childcare, domestic work, and their paid job, but they weren't really getting ahead in their paid job because they were perceived to be, mothers who prioritized family over work. And that is an area of inequality that I've heard women feel frustrated by.
So in your reporting, do you get a sense of a recognition of that inequality? Certainly among the women whose life chances are blocked, they would be much more aware, but in their families with their husbands or with their parents or even in their social networks, do you get a real sense that there's a coherent awareness of that, almost a grievance of the lack of opportunity? Is that something?
It really does depend on the people and the context. even at a place like University of Tokyo, these are the cream of the crop. These women have worked so hard. They have so many obstacles that they have to get over, not least of which is cultural expectations. I mean, the number of times I heard women tell me that the reason why there were so few women at Todai was simply because they had been told that it was going to ruin their marriage prospects, that was such a common refrain, so that not only did they have to work really hard academically, but they also had to sort of overcome this prejudice of people telling them like, oh, you're going to ruin your life chances in a certain part of, in the social, personal aspect of your life, should you want to get married, that you would expect that all of these women would be, therefore super aggressive and wanting all these opportunities. But again, even within that community, there was a range of opinions of people who are, I got here, I worked really hard, I expect to work until I get married. And then I hope that I will have the opportunity to meet someone who's, equal intellectually, but will also provide good financial support so that I don't have to work so hard. And then there were others who were like, gosh darn it, I worked so hard to get here and this is what I want to do with my career and I don't want to have to give it up and I don't want to have to feel like I'm getting second class opportunities simply because I'm a woman. So, I don't think no group of people are monolithic and it doesn't really matter the context. And I think that's something that I love about journalism is that if you really go out with an open mind and you're listening to what people are telling you, sometimes it surprises you. Because I will admit that just, naturally I would have assumed that of all groups of people where I was doing interviews that at the most prestigious university in Japan, that all the women there would be super hyper ambitious. But they were just like any other group of women. There are a range of people with different aspirations and feelings.
I think it's a very important point to be very careful about how you represent a group of people. It's easy to kind of reify the Japanese as though they're one unified voice. In fact, there's diversity and there's differences among people, different life experiences, ideologies. And that's the worst kind of journalism or sociology or whatever, to try to reify culture instead of really looking at the details and the differences between people.
Right.
Somewhat comparable issue, we're talking here about justice and equality in one frame, is the way that race and ethnicity is represented and thought of in Japan. And more recently, we've had at my university a group of very dedicated students organized a Black Lives Matter movement march with the Tokyo organization. And
I think I the Sierra Todd.
That's right. About 3,500 people showed up, and it was really impressive. But in your reporting on issues related to race, ethnicity, and cultural identity, what are some of the insights that you've come to?
Well, it's very different than reporting on race and ethnicity here than it is in the United States. I mean, I think that whenever I write this, people get very upset. But there's no question that Japan is much more homogenous racially, ethnically than the United States. So I think that's just an objective truth. That being said, there's obviously enormous diversity within Japan, and that there are deep-seated and long-standing issues that have become incredibly politicized as well, just as they are in the United States. And when I did recent reporting on sort of how the Black Lives Matter movement, that there were some organized marches to show solidarity with the movement back in the United States, mainly organized by people like Sierra Todd at Temple, but also in Fukuoka, Osaka, Kyoto, Americans who are living here or studying here who were organizing these marches. They also wanted to bring Japanese supporters in, both to recognize what's going on globally, but also to be a little more introspective about what happens in Japan. And I think different people brought different sort of angles to that. I think the Black students and Americans who are living here kind of wanted the Japanese to recognize how it might be for them here, that there is clearly racism against African Americans who come to live and work here, and that they experience also for children of biracial marriages, that there are people who suffer bullying and discrimination. But there are also groups that have lived here for many generations, like the Zainichi Korean community, the Ainu, the Ryukyu of Okinawa. It's not really race or ethnicity per se, but the Buraku class has faced a lot of discrimination. And so I tried to talk to representatives of those different groups about how they felt about it and whether or not, people who consider themselves, quote unquote mainstream Japanese, whether they recognize that that racism is not just something that they see on their televisions going on in the United States or in South Africa, but it's something that happens here in Japan. And when I talk to scholars about that, who are scholars of ethnic studies, they said that one of the problems in Japan is that, even in the kind of elementary, middle, and high school curriculum and in the textbooks, when racism is discussed, it's sort of, there was slavery in the United States, there was apartheid in South Africa, and that's how the word or the concept of racism is taught here. And there isn't a lot of discussion about what is happening here. And of course, again, that goes back to sort of the politics, the history. There's a fairly strong right-wing sentiment here that kind of wants to paper over Japan's colonial and history of aggression during World War II, which is connected to some of the feelings about Korean community here or Chinese community here. So I think it's something that there's still, Japan is in the process of going through kind of awakening or reckoning or whatever word you want to use in terms of the broader public really thinking about these issues in a kind of deep and thoughtful way, in the way that right now in the United States, because of recent horrible events, Americans are sort of being forced to think about these issues that have been around for a very long time there, by the way. I mean, I think the African-American community in the United States is like, how come you're just waking up to it now? It's not like this just started yesterday. So I think it's similar in Japan.
I think that's one benefit or one impact that my university, Temple University Japan, has had. We've been here since the early 1980s, and being an American university in Japan, it provides an opportunity for study abroad students and a lot of Asian students, including many Japanese students, to experience an English language American style education. But we also are comprised of students from about 60 countries, and they bring with them their culture and their experiences. And so I hope to think that we're having some positive impact. I mean, we're provoking discussions and considerations, certainly teaching a different kind of education than what some Asian or Japanese students, as you mentioned, would get within their schools. Do you have a sense of that, of the New York Times being a kind of what's called gaiatsu, a foreign influence, that you, through your reporting, are in some way bringing about positive social change? I know that may not be an explicit agenda necessarily, but it is a product of the kind of you do.
I mean, it just seems so kind of, self-aggrandizing to even consider that might be a possibility. I do know that Japan does have more of a sense of being aware of and paying attention to gaiatsu than, say, in the United States, where we're this very kind of self-centered country that doesn't really care what anybody else thinks. Yeah. And that Japan is different in that way. And then, of course, Japan and the United States have a particular, an obviously unique, really long-standing relationship that goes back to the occupation. So there's that. I will say that on gender and race, and particularly on kind of mixed race issues, I have been so moved by the women who have reached out to me, the mixed race people who have reached out to me after I've written stories about those topics to say, thank you, or you've opened my eyes, or you've enabled me to feel like I could talk about these issues that I've already been thinking about. So it's not so much that I'm pushing them or bringing about social change, but rather they've already been thinking about these issues, but having it out there in a public, from an international publication, allows them to talk about it in circles that they might not previously have felt comfortable doing so.
You're kind of a conduit for people's voices.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, literally, that's what I do is I interview people. It's not like just me and my opinions. It's like, it's very important to me that what I am conveying is people that I've interviewed, and that I'm trying as hard as I can to like fairly represent Japan and Japanese people, and not just be like, here's my opinion about what I see.
Well, I think writing for, as they say, the paper of record, the New York Times, it certainly has an influence. People pay attention. I know the limited extent that I've seen some of our university professors quoted in your paper. There's almost immediate feedback. People start contacting them. Our director of Asian Studies, Jeff Kingston. So as you mentioned right now, it seems like, the moon that eclipses all suns is the COVID crisis. And I know that there are many different prongs or aspects of that. So what are some of the issues that you've been focusing on with the COVID? You had started with the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which was the first outbreak in Yokohama, where that languished in port for a couple of weeks, but while they worked that out. Maybe that might be a good place to start. Could you talk a little bit about some of the insights that you derived from that reporting on the Diamond cruise ship?
Right. Well, that was not just about Japan, obviously. That was very much also about the response of the Princess Cruises. But in as much as it was sort of, at the time that it happened, it's kind of hard to believe now, but at the time that it happened, it was like it's separate. The Diamond Princess ship and the outbreak there was like a separate category in the WHO reports about COVID, and that it was the largest outbreak outside of China at the time,
right.
Something like 700 cases. At the time, it was like, the biggest thing that was happening outside of China with regard to COVID. And then, of course, it was this sort of unprecedented situation in which this ship happened. It was the last stop on its cruise. That's why it was there. And all of the passengers were supposed to disembark. And then they found, on their way to their last stop in Yokohama, they found out that there had been this passenger who'd gotten off in Hong Kong who was infected. And so then there had to be this scramble decision of what to do. And I think it did expose a lot of, you've certainly written about disaster response before with regard to Fukushima. It sort of exposed the seeming incompetence, the kind of keystone cop aspect of the Japanese bureaucracy. It seemed like it wasn't, they couldn't even get it together to coordinate with the captain of the ship of when they were going to announce the results of the tests. And so there was this echo chamber of passengers talking to journalists talking to passengers, and then, passengers literally like playing the recording of the captain telling them how many test results had come back before the Japanese health ministry could tell anyone. And so it created this impression that the Japanese government didn't know what it was doing, and that it had a terrible communication strategy, even if it was doing something. And then there was this case of this Professor Iwata-san who went on the ship and then posted this YouTube video in both English and Japanese, very dramatically describing, how, he had done all this work in infectious diseases and Ebola and malaria, and this was the worst situation he'd ever seen. So then it really got scary because it felt like not only was it sort of a situation where maybe it was just the left hand's not talking to the right hand bureaucracy problem, that it was actually a problem that they weren't doing a good job on the ship. And in the fullness of time, we all look back and it appears that the epidemiological data appears to show that the vast number of infections occurred in a 3 or 4 day window after the initial infected passenger or passengers, let's presume that maybe there wasn't just one, but we only knew of one, got off the ship, and then they were all mixing and mingling and hanging out for 3 or 4 days. And that was as much a Princess Cruise problem as it was a Japanese government problem. And then they docked, and then they imposed the quarantine. And then after they imposed the quarantine, it does seem, if you look at the epidemiological data, that the number of infections did seem to fall off. So to the extent that they may have been, messing up with the red zones and the green zones and not conducting good infection control on the ship, it may not have been as bad as it originally seemed at the time. In terms of takeaways from that, it did seem like Japan didn't quite have everything under control. Even at the end when they were letting people off the ship, they were just releasing people onto public transit. And then that seemed strange. One thing we knew was that you were supposed to quarantine people, and that all the other governments that were airlifting their people out of the ship were taking them back to their home countries and forcing them to go through quarantine again. And whereas in Japan, the people who literally walked off the boat and got on buses and trains and sort of dispersed into the population. And then there were some reports that a couple of them, after having initially tested negative and left the ship, were testing positive. So at that point, it seemed like, oh my gosh, we are about to see this huge outbreak across Japan. They don't know what they're doing. And for quite a while, we would all go to these press conferences, and it really did feel like there was a definite lack of transparency. There was a lack of testing. There was a lack of good explanation other than this is how we're doing it. Don't challenge us.
Right.
which seemed from your work and others, a fairly conventional Japanese government response in disaster management. There had been so much criticism of both how the Japanese government and TEPCO had managed information flow in the immediate aftermath of the Fukushima disaster, and that that is the surest way to create distrust in the public.
Right.
But it did seem over time, in fairness to the Japanese government, that we haven't had a kind of outbreak or that they had in Italy or UK or the United States. We don't know, of course, whether some of that is luck or underlying health of the population or this seemingly discredited but floated around theory about how it was to do with the tuberculosis vaccine that everybody in Japan is required to have. There are all kinds of theories as to why there haven't been outbreaks in Japan, and I think there's no simplistic one answer to that. I think the other thing that has been common about the Japanese response is that on the one hand, they're not particularly transparent, but they also bombard everybody with minute detailed paperwork as if that is their way of being transparent. But, you kind of look over the paperwork and you think, well, this is a lot of paperwork and a lot of graphs and a lot of numbers, but they aren't actually telling me what I really, really want to know.
In my Fukushima research, I interviewed William Sposato, who is an editor for the Wall Street Journal in Japan. And he had talked about how TEPCO was drowning the journalists in data, that they would just throw all these unprocessed numbers at them. Typical nuclear experts, they had no way to make sense of it. What they needed was an interpretive frame to be able to know what those numbers meant. And in a manner, it seems to be a form of transparency. I don't know if it's kind of strategic to confuse people and drown them in these numbers. But when I look at a situation like what happened in Fukushima and also with the Diamond cruise ship, it just totally befuddles me why a country that is so well organized. As I've thought on this, I think one of the issues here is, I think a kind of what I might call a fallacy of good faith, that everyone's going to act in good faith and therefore you trust people. You don't really challenge or question their assumptions or the assertions that they make. And also, allowing people to just mingle out into the city. Well, of course, a good faith assumption would be people are going to take precautions. They're going to wear a mask. It's going to be okay. And that's a pretty dangerous assumption. But it's rooted on the fact that people do follow the rules and act in good faith. That's one of the things that makes Japan so livable. And then the other thing that I reluctantly have come to conclude is that there's a fallacy of competency. That just because these bureaucrats have confidence in what they're doing and just because they seem to be organized doesn't necessarily mean that they're technically proficient or competent, particularly when they're in realms like a nuclear disaster or an epidemiological crisis that require scientific knowledge and expertise.
They've shown in this recent episode that they're not necessarily trusting the epidemiological expertise that they have. They handpicked the people on their original advisory committee. It seemed like they picked people who they knew would be very loyal and kind of follow the line. And now they've changed the composition of the committee to devalue, it seems, public health experts. The other thing is that Japan doesn't, in this particular crisis, I learned that Japan doesn't really have a very strong epidemiological culture, that it's a much more medical culture. So the way of dealing with a disease outbreak is to treat the sickest people. And so a lot of their sort of original explanation for why they weren't testing people was we're testing the really sick people and we're treating them. And that is our approach. Whereas in the United States, so I would talk to sort of CDC folks who would say, who'd come over here, because there were a few of them who came during the Diamond Princess. They're like, part of epidemiology is we want to learn about the virus, and that you can only do that if you're testing, and you have to do other and doing kind of anthropological research, as it were, epidemiological research, in order to understand how this virus operates. You can't only get that from treating the sickest people. So it's just a fundamental difference in approach. And I think the Japanese have been very confident, as you say, that, so far they've contained it relatively well using that largely kind of surgical medical approach of the sickest people. Even now, as the case numbers are rising and Westerners are sort of looking at that and saying, okay, so 2 months ago when we had these kind of numbers, we were requesting that businesses close and that people not leave their homes. Why are you not doing that now? And they'll say, well, because it's not a medical problem. These are young people who are going to host clubs, but they're mild symptoms, so it's fine. Whereas I think in the States, there's a different approach to that. It's like the numbers are the numbers. It's an outbreak. We need to sort of rein it back in. But we also want to learn more about how the disease is traveling based on kind of epidemiological information. So I think there is that difference. But I think you're also very, very right in the kind of faith of a good, that Japan puts a lot of faith that everybody will kind of do the right thing. And, what's interesting is on certain things, it's a pretty fair assumption, right? Like mask wearing, for example, like our country, they're fighting over whether to wear masks. But here, generally speaking, most people are wearing masks. It's not 100%, but, there's still some controversy, I guess not controversy, but some unknowns about exactly what protection masks provide. But at least when you look at the correlative data, almost everyone who's looked at masks says that somewhere around 80% coverage rate really does reduce infection transmission. So if you've got about 80% compliance, then that might be part of the answer. And I think so to have 100% faith that everyone will do the right thing is obviously misplaced, because there's always going to be people who won't. But I think it doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing to say in Japan. And maybe, again, this is a slightly stereotype thing, but like, generally speaking, people take their trash out of the stadium and they don't dump it on the train platform. And generally speaking, people obey the traffic lights. And generally speaking, everybody's wearing masks. So it doesn't seem like a totally, out of whack assumption in some ways.
I think in many ways it's readily evident. But, in comparing COVID to the United States, as with many things, comparing Japan to the United States on COVID response, that's maybe not the best comparison to make. What's more interesting in many ways is to compare Japan to other Asian countries, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand to some extent. These countries, South Korea, they all have relatively low case rates, and they do it in a very different kind of way. I hesitate to say that there has something to do with a kind of some extent of an authoritarian society that imposes rules and people follow those rules. It was interesting when Japan had this kind of semi-lockdown, which legally they couldn't really require, but in reality, it was a de facto lockdown because people followed those rules and they didn't defy it. We've seen in the United States. So it's a really interesting puzzle, and it's something that may take a number of years to really untangle, because this is a shout out to a previous podcast that we did just a couple of weeks ago with the TUJ professor Sachiko Horiguchi and her colleague Sachiko Ozone, who's at Tsukuba University. They have a 10-person research team comprised of 5 practicing medical clinical doctors and then 5 anthropologists. And what the doctors were saying is that they don't really rely on any kind of top-down initiative or directives. Like in the United States, you have the CDC. There's also the World Health Organization. And then at a state level, you have health ministries or authorities. But in Japan, this seems to be operating among the social professional networks of medical doctors and also at a clinical level. And I mean, this is so overdetermined, it would take a long time even to enumerate all the issues. But one of the factors is that you have the ready availability of healthcare because you have national health insurance, and for children at least it's virtually free. You have clinics that are dispersed all throughout. I mean, in my neighborhood, there's probably a dozen clinics within less than a kilometer. There's more than that, actually. And then also the doctors really, because it's at a local level, the doctors really know their patients, when they're looking at issues of comorbidity. Whether or not they have high blood pressure, they can look into their medical records and they can see that very clearly. So it seems that what's happening in Japan is like maybe what could be called earlier intervention, or nuanced analysis of what's going on. So people don't go to the doctor when they're suffering very extreme, life-threatening symptoms. They're able to go to the doctor, at the first sign of that. And the doctors are making an assessment. So my local doctor, who I respect very much, he had been a visiting professor at Columbia University and worked in Presbyterian Hospital in New York City. I asked him how many people had he sent to the hospital, and he said 2. And then we talked a while, and he kind of smiled and said, now ask me how many people had COVID. And I said, well, and he said 50.
Oh my goodness.
And I said, so how did you know that? Did you test them? He said, I didn't need to test them. I know. He said the symptoms are very evident and they're very distinctive. And he was utterly confident that he could analyze that without the testing. So it seems that in Japan, to the extent that there's under-testing, they don't think that the testing is necessary because they think they can deal with it through inferential diagnostic methods.
Right. Just the medical profession. I mean, the other thing that not just about COVID, but sort of generally that might explain the lower COVID rates, although what you're saying is that the COVID rate is much higher. It's just not listed as such in the testing because the government only reports positive PCR tests. So if your doctor is a representative, then that would be a report of 2 positive tests and 50 who are not reported. But the other thing is that kind of preventive annual checkups in Japan have this sacred event, right? That everybody gets them, and they're pretty comprehensive and thorough. Same with dental care and eye care. In a way that in the United States it isn't like that. That your annual checkup might just be 5 minutes with your doctor, whereas here it's like this battery of tests, and then the general emphasis on dietary health and that kind of thing here is very different from other cultures. But to your point about comparing with other countries in Asia, one of the things that has surprised me about Japan and that I find weird and seems kind of a cognitive dissonance between the kind of general policy is that they're banning, people coming from over 100 countries now, and that they're not even letting foreigners who live here leave and go back to their home countries and then re-enter without special exception. And yet, when Japanese travel abroad and come back, they're not particularly rigorous about how they impose quarantine controls. So, we have colleagues all over the place, so I know how things are happening in, say, Taiwan and Hong Kong, and they are not messing around there. You can't even leave the airport until you get your test result, and then you go straight to the facility. In Taiwan, you have to go straight to a government facility. In Hong Kong, you have to wear this bracelet where they can track you for 2 weeks. In Japan, it's sort of like they give you a test at the airport, and then it's a faith that you'll do the right thing. Like, okay, just don't leave your house, don't take public transit for 2 weeks. And I guess most people are complying with that, but surely not all. And so it's interesting to me because that has seemed to be part of what the success of places like New Zealand, Thailand, Vietnam has really been, like complete lockdown of their borders. And that since Japan has gone to the effort of, basically banning people from coming from all these countries, it's a little strange to me that they're not doing that final piece of really being rigorous about controlling people who do come in.
Well, to me, this is reminding me of what had happened in 2003 when Japan shared the World Cup in soccer with Korea. They changed immigration policy around at that time, and I'd had a student overstayed a visa, and it went into a criminal case, and I was very surprised because back in the day, it used to be that if a person overstayed a visa for a week or whatever, they had to write an apology note, and they would have a dressing down, and then they could move on. But they set up a criminal division. And at that time, this was 2003. So I asked the immigration officer, was this because of 2001 and something to do with like Homeland Security and things like that? And he said, no, it was because of the World Cup, that they were really afraid that hooligans were going to be coming in from England and from around the world to really run roughshod over, they had this, in the mass media, you had a lot of representation of these troglodyte kind of hooligans going crazy. And so they use that as an opportunity to tighten up immigration controls. So the way that Japan deals with this is at the point of entree, which is immigration. And obviously it's not just about COVID. It's a more recent example of that. And it could be one of the reasons that Japan doesn't have terrorism. I know that as we were going into the Olympics, the Department of Homeland Security, there are people in the U.S. Embassy that deal with this. They're very concerned about Japan being unprepared. A person can walk on a Shinkansen without any screening, and they just don't have that kind of comprehensive screening. And Japan seems to think that they've dealt with it by having an extraordinarily strict immigration policy. And there are racist overtones to that as well, as you mentioned, because, relying Japanese to come in because by category, they're considered to be okay.
Right. They won't break the rules. They're very safe, but yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of categorical thinking is, I think, one of the fundamental premises of racism.
Absolutely. And when we were talking about race, I was sort of remiss in not mentioning that to the extent that Japan has immigration, it's very small. Obviously Japan has been routinely criticized by the international community for their lack of acceptance of refugees and asylum applicants, and that, they have these detention centers where people are not treated very well. And there are a lot of complaints about discrimination against the few people who are of foreign birth and foreign appearance here in Japan. So that definitely is an issue.
Well, I would have thought that this time of the year we would be talking about nothing but Olympics. So I think I'd be remiss not to at least bring it up a little bit. So what are your predictions? What do you think is going to happen with Olympics? Because that's going to preoccupy your life for many months if we return to that. And I guess we won't know again until, May?
Well, I mean, the Japanese government and the Tokyo government are very determined to stick to the narrative that we have postponed it to 2021 and it will be this sort of glorious, triumph over COVID. And I noticed the other day I was watching television, they even already have sort of an ad campaign that quite clever, 2020 plus one, 2021, that they've put together. And so, certainly the organizing committee, the Tokyo metropolitan government, and the government of Japan are very committed to this current plan, which was decided with the IOC. But, realistically speaking, the problem is not what can they just get COVID under control in Japan? I mean, the very nature of the event is inviting people from all over the world to come together. And if you're going to do that, it's a lot of visitors and spectators and people moving along in public transit. I mean, the whole plan for the Tokyo Olympics is to mainly rely on public transit. So unless they're going to stage it without spectators, which then is sort of not really the Olympics, and even so, you're still going to be bringing in a lot of athletes. Unless we see a definitive control of the virus around the world, it's kind of hard to imagine, even if the Tokyo government says, or the Japanese government says they're willing to host it, I can imagine a lot of other governments saying, well, we're not really willing to send our people to an international event. It wouldn't be about Japan per se, but just, if you're in a country like Finland or something, or Vietnam, or where they have managed to bring the virus under control, are they going to want to send their people to an event that's going to be drawing people from all over the world, including the United States, if the United States is still in the kind of chaotic state that it is now? But having said that, when all of this started, none of us could have predicted that we would be in this position even now. I mean, it's sort of hard to imagine. I'm a parent, just the idea that we're still not sure what's exactly going to be happening with our kids in the fall. It's just sort of insane that this is nothing like any of us have ever experienced. So I would be hesitant to predict what will be happening a year from now.
It's a nightmare for the public relations of the Olympic committees and the Japanese government. I thought it was very ironic that they were trying to brand the 2020 Olympics as the Reconstruction Olympics and starting the torch relay up in Fukushima.
Right.
And, now you have COVID. I doubt if they'll be starting the torch relay at the site where the Diamond Princess cruised. But yeah, again, these are narratives of recovery, and the 1964 Olympics had that. One of the initiators of the torch relay was a survivor of the Hiroshima bombings. So right. I guess that is a kind of aspirational thing. And I may be the only person I know who's really looking forward to the Olympics. I'd love to go. Maybe now I can finally get a ticket. But
right. It's really fun. I went to the Pyeongchang Olympics and had a blast, much to my surprise. So it is a wonderful and great event. Although, of course, before COVID, we were all terrified of what was going to happen with heat stroke and potentially with typhoons. And so, it was always going to be a somewhat fraught event. But now, who knows if it'll even happen?
It is not the one thing. So I really appreciate you taking the time out of your very, very busy day. I know that
Sure.
It's kind of nonstop for you. And I've really admired your work and have used it in my classes, and I've learned a lot about it. And I just I think you're doing important work, and I appreciate your contribution.
And I always appreciate your help and insights on disaster management and the bureaucracy of Japan. So it's definitely been a reciprocal appreciation.
One of our former students, I think, is now working with you. So
yes, she's fantastic. We're so lucky to have her.
Yeah. Well, Motoko, thanks again for taking the time, and
thank you.
Hope to be in touch.
We'll definitely be in touch. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much. This is Temple University Japan's ICAST through the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. If you'd like more information and to see our previous archive of events, look to the ICAS website, and also we have an archive on YouTube with previous events. Thanks for joining us today.